it was easy to do that because I knew what the book was about.
That's something interesting they both talked about with having to write stories to like fill the book, and that seems to me incredibly difficult. Like to write a story, I mean that's just I work differently, but to like write a story kind of directly at like a certain theme or hole you see in your work, or how you identify that hole in the first place. And so like I need one story that says this or does this somehow in the story. You could talk like about that experience, or was it more difficult than writing a normal story, or was it somehow easier, like knowing that you were working on this book project and seeing it that way?
I think it was hard. It was definitely difficult because you can't just sit down and say, well, I'm going to write a story about this and it's going to be fantastic and people are going to want to read it in a book. It's just that I start so many projects, and I didn't just say, well, I want 2 more stories that fit this theme.
Mm-hmm.
I probably wrote 10 more stories
Right.
that fit the theme, and I took the 2 that actually worked because I wrote a couple stories that I thought were like, oh wow, this is going to be great. This is just talks about the book, and then you know, I get to, I don't have an ending for it. I don't know what the story's about, so it's not that easy. But since, you know, books take a long time to get published,
Right.
we have time to do that. So,
Right.
so that's pretty easy.
For me, it was liberating because one problem I've had is that I like to write really long stories,
Mm-hmm.
you know, stories that'll be 50, 60, 70 pages. And they're not always hard to place. I mean, a day to do less, I sent it to the Gettysburg Review and they published it. But at other times, they're really hard to place because magazines want stories that are, you know, 15, 20 pages long. And I realized at a certain point, I have a book contract. I can write any kind of book I want. And so I did. And it was great. And I could think about thematic things that weren't yet grappled with that needed to be to make the whole picture of the story that I wanted. And even the last story, I could craft it like it was the last story. So it could span, you know, 5 decades and 2 continents, and it could end with a metaphor that stands in for the whole book, which is a woman at a multinational corporation saying to someone who's searching for someone else, "We've lost the record, you know, we can't be held responsible, but we're very sorry." Knowing full well that like she doesn't care, and also knowing full well that that's sort of the way that all the characters in a sense go through the book. I mean, sometimes they're generous to other people, and sometimes they feel a sense of responsibility to other people, but when it comes right down to it, people throw up their hands and say, well, I can't really be held responsible for what I've inflicted on someone else. You know, life is short.
Yeah, I can see that as I'm running through the book. It's interesting to come around to that as the final, you know, words in the book, and to have a chance to craft those individually. Did you find that the last thing you wrote for your book that you were thinking of in that terms? I know the last thing you wrote isn't the last story.
No.
So it's different for that.
No, I think I settled pretty early on what was going to be the last story because it's like the most hopeful ending. It was kind of like, instead of disaster befalling the characters during the story or in the first line, the disaster had happened previously. And the story is kind of about kind of a contrition, and at the end is a really hopeful image, and I wanted that because I think there's so many of the stories, there's 25 stories in the book, and so many of them end in this like kind of flux and they're hopeless. But I think this one ended as like, wow, the sun's coming out and people are holding their hands and walking, you know, straight forward and almost into it on the horizon, and so I thought that was a nice hopeful image. It also set up the sequel for when the sun crashes into the earth and the people burn. But anyway.
Well, one of the other things I think that you both talked about when we were talking about selecting and organizing these books is that transition from thinking about writing individual stories and sending them out to thinking about like a book project, and I imagine like as you move forward, it's hard to think of writing like new stories or new, you know, essays or things without thinking of them as book projects or parts of books. Has that been a transition that you felt as you're working on individual pieces?
Oh yeah, I mean now that I know what a book is and that it has to have a theme and come together, and I've been taught that, it's hard not to think of like, well, how would this fit in?
Right.
But one thing that I don't want to do is ever abandon something that I'm writing because I'm like, well, that doesn't fit into this project right now. Because I think that's dangerous if you start saying like, wow, this is really great, but wow, it doesn't fit into my next book project, so I'm just going to close the file and for something else. I think if I write a 10-page story that has nothing to do with my next book, and it's great, then that's fine, and then I'll go back to what I started with. I'll send it to a journal and hopefully get a good journal publication, because if anything, that'll just spread the word about, you know, what I do a little bit more. And plus, it's also gratifying to get those story publications, no matter how many times. I've had, I think, 47 publications, and it doesn't really wear off. It's like, wow, that's still this affirmation that you get from a stranger that is pretty is pretty great. So no, even though I look at a project now, I'm definitely not trying to like give up on anything that's not in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, although I have to say, like, I have this book now, and it's well published, and I did a 25-city tour, and I know that it's sold fairly well for what it is. But you think about the question now of cultural relevance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if I sell a couple thousand copies of this book, like, so what? You know, and you look at the books that you really love, or I look at the books that I really
Right.
love, and some of them are not huge sellers. Like I really like the work of Stephen Dixon. You know?
Mm-hmm.
But then I look at a writer like Philip Roth, or I look at people who write nonfiction books, or I look at people whose books are made into movies, and I think those people really had an opportunity to reach like a vast number of readers, and I started to think, well, I want to do that too.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm also thinking about questions like, okay, now I wrote my small book. Now, am I going to keep doing that, or do I want to sort of tackle something that's bigger and have the opportunity to reach more readers? And I think I do.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good place to transition, talking about what you guys are working on now, what you do next. I know you have several projects underway of varying levels of that kind of complexity and possible reach. So do you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm working on a nonfiction book. It's about a child abduction case in the Haitian countryside. So I've been traveling to Haiti a lot to gather information for that book, and I hope I'll finish it maybe by fall. And I'm also working on a novel that's about Americans in Haiti. You watched The Wire, Mike?
No, I've never seen it.
Oh, you have to see it. It's so great. The first season starts out on the street corners in Baltimore with the drug trade. And then the second season, sort of, the camera pans out a little bit more. And by the fifth season, you're like up in the governor's office and you're in the seats of power. And I kind of like that. Like, I like the idea of the work sort of steadily expanding outward until it can encompass a lot more of the
Yeah,
world.
I like that too.
I know one thing that I'm not going to write another story, a book of stories about people communicating in their bedrooms.
Mhm.
Like, I've done that. There's 25 stories in that book. So I know that I don't want to not write a story like that if I think I have a great idea for one, but at the same time, I'm trying to move away from that. Like, I don't think I could write the same book again. I don't want to do that, and I don't think, and so far I haven't, so that's good.